A racist white woman humiliates a black man on a plane, and she is shocked to discover the real identity of the black man. As James Carter, a calm and composed black man, stepped onto Flight 289, the cabin buzzed with activity as passengers stowed their luggage and settled into their seats. Navigating the narrow aisle with polite "excuse me" murmurs, he made his way to his assigned seat near the emergency exit, unaware of the watchful eyes of Sarah Walker, a white woman sitting a few rows back. Sarah's gaze lingered on James, her magazine forgotten on her lap. Something about him unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint why. He seemed perfectly ordinary, his demeanor calm, his movements unhurried. Yet, as he settled into his seat and began flipping through a book, her discomfort grew. Her fingers drummed nervously on the armrest, her thoughts racing. Was it his presence near the emergency exit, or something less tangible? Her unease had no basis in reason, but it persisted. Observing him through the corner of her eye, Sarah's thoughts began to spiral, fueled by assumptions she could neither justify nor explain, setting the stage for a tense and revealing journey. As Sarah Walker continued to watch James Carter from her seat, her discomfort grew stronger. Unable to shake her suspicions, she signaled for Lisa, the flight attendant, to come over. Lisa approached with her usual polite smile, leaning in slightly to hear Sarah's hushed tone. "Excuse me," Sarah began, glancing toward James, who was calmly engrossed in his book near the emergency exit. "Is it really safe to have someone like him sitting there?" Lisa's professional demeanor didn't falter. She followed Sarah's gaze briefly before responding with a reassuring tone. "Ma'am, I assure you, everyone on board has passed through thorough security checks. Our seating arrangements comply fully with safety regulations." Sarah frowned, her lips tightening in disapproval. "I just think, with everything you see on the news these days, it's better to be cautious," she added, her voice laced with tension. Lisa's smile remained steady, though her eyes showed a flicker of unease. "If there's anything specific you're concerned about, please let me know. We want all our passengers to feel safe and comfortable," she said before moving on to attend to other passengers. Still unconvinced, Sarah watched James intently, her distrust unwavering despite Lisa's reassurance. Sarah Walker's eyes remained fixed on James Carter as he reached into his carry-on bag. Her unease deepened with each movement he made, her mind racing to interpret his actions. James, completely unaware of her scrutiny, calmly retrieved a small bottle of medication, checking the label briefly before placing it back in his bag. His demeanor was relaxed, his actions routine, but Sarah saw them through a lens of suspicion. "What is he hiding?" she wondered, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. Her imagination ran wild, fueled by her preconceived notions, as she continued to watch James with growing mistrust, unable to accept the peaceful normalcy of his behavior. As Sarah Walker's unease over James Carter's presence persisted, Lisa, the flight attendant, couldn't ignore the subtle tension brewing. During her routine checks, Lisa leaned in to speak quietly with her colleague Jim, stationed at the back of the plane. "Keep an eye on seat 14C, she whispered, referring to James. "There's a passenger in 18A who seems agitated about him. She's mentioned concerns, but there's nothing specific." Jim raised an eyebrow but nodded. "What's the issue?" he asked, glancing toward the front of the cabin. Lisa shrugged lightly, her professionalism unwavering. "Nothing tangible, just one of those gut feelings from her. It's probably nothing, but better to be cautious." The hum of the plane's engines grew louder, signaling the imminent takeoff. Passengers settled into their seats, buckling seatbelts and stowing away last-minute items. Lisa and Jim exchanged another look before returning to their respective duties, each silently preparing for any potential developments. As the plane taxied down the runway, Lisa cast a brief glance at James, who remained calm and oblivious to the scrutiny. Meanwhile, Sarah's unease deepened, setting the stage for a tense journey ahead. As Flight 289 leveled off after takeoff, Passengers began settling into their routines. The cabin filled with the soft rustle of pages turning, the hum of conversations, and the occasional chime of flight attendants moving down the aisle. James Carter, seated near the emergency exit, leaned forward to unzip his carry-on bag and retrieve a small water bottle. His movements were deliberate and calm, but Sarah Walker, seated a few rows back, watched him with intense scrutiny. Her eyes narrowed as she noted how carefully he handled the bag before zipping it back up. To Sarah, the action seemed suspicious, her mind racing to assign a darker meaning to it. What was he hiding in there? Why did he keep checking that bag? While James relaxed in his seat and took a sip of water, Sarah's unease grew into full-blown suspicion. She scanned the other passengers, noting that most were engrossed in their own activities, seemingly oblivious to what she perceived as a potential threat. Her heart raced as her thoughts spiraled further, convinced that she was witnessing something unusual. Sarah resolved to keep a close watch on James, ready to act if necessary. As the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Sarah Walker's discomfort over James Carter reached a breaking point. Unable to contain her suspicions any longer, she raised her hand, signaling for Lisa, the flight attendant, to return. Lisa approached with her usual composed smile, leaning in to listen. "Excuse me," Sarah began in a hushed but firm voice, gesturing discreetly toward James. "I've been watching that man near the emergency exit. He keeps checking his bag, like he's nervous about something inside. I really think you should take a look." Lisa glanced in James's direction. He was calmly sipping from a water bottle, his demeanor untroubled. Returning her attention to Sarah, Lisa replied with her usual professionalism. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, all passengers and their belongings have been thoroughly screened before boarding. Unless there's a clear and immediate concern, we cannot search someone's personal items." Sarah's expression tightened, her frustration evident. "You people never take these things seriously until it's too late," she muttered, crossing her arms. "Normal? How can you call his behavior normal? People like him act normal until they don't." Lisa's polite smile remained fixed, though a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but Mr. Carter has not exhibited any disruptive behavior. Please try to relax and enjoy the flight. If you notice anything concrete, don't hesitate to let us know." Feeling dismissed and unheard, Sarah huffed and turned back to her seat, her suspicions and irritation only growing. As the flight continued, Sarah Walker's frustration reached a boiling point. Convinced that James Carter posed a threat, she began scanning the cabin, hoping to find another passenger who shared her concerns. Her gaze landed on a middle-aged woman. Sitting next to her, flipping through a magazine. Leaning slightly closer, Sarah whispered, "Excuse me, but have you noticed the man near the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem, off to you?" The woman paused, surprised by the sudden question. She glanced briefly in James's direction, then back at Sarah. "I don't know," she replied hesitantly. "He seems fine to me. What's the issue?" Sarah frowned, her tone growing more insistent. "He's been acting suspicious since we boarded. Keeps checking his bag like he's hiding something. I told the flight attendants, but they're ignoring it. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry?" The woman offered a polite but dismissive smile. I think if there was really a problem, the crew would handle it. I'm sure it's nothing," she said, turning back to her magazine. Undeterred, Sarah looked around for another potential ally. Her eyes landed on a younger woman sitting across the aisle who had been glancing at James occasionally. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah leaned over and asked in a low voice, "You see that man by the emergency exit? Like he's hiding something? Like he's hiding something?" The younger woman, slightly startled, looked at James and then back at Sarah. "I don't really see anything wrong," she said cautiously. Maybe he's just keeping to himself. I wouldn't worry about it. Sarah's irritation deepened with each interaction. No one seemed to understand the urgency of her concerns. Feeling increasingly isolated, she muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable. Everyone's so blind to what's right in front of them." Determined not to let it go, Sarah continued to steal glances at James, watching his every movement. He appeared relaxed, flipping through his book, occasionally sipping from his water bottle, completely unaware of the scrutiny he was under. The dismissive responses from the passengers around her only fueled Sarah's resolve. "If no one else is going to take this seriously, I will," she thought, her eyes narrowing. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed, frustration etched across her face. For Sarah, the lack of validation from others wasn't a deterrent. It was a challenge. She decided to stay vigilant, watching and waiting for what she was certain would be the moment her suspicions were justified. As Flight 289 hummed steadily through the skies, Sarah Walker's frustration boiled over. She had watched James Carter intently since takeoff, convinced he posed a threat, and now, unable to hold back any longer, she raised her hand sharply to signal Lisa, the flight attendant, once again. Lisa approached with her signature calm demeanor, her smile professional but slightly strained after Sarah's earlier concerns. "Yes, ma'am, how can I assist you?" Lisa asked evenly, leaning down to ensure privacy in their conversation. Sarah leaned closer, her voice low but charged with urgency. "It's him," she said, gesturing toward James with a quick tilt of her head. "I've been watching him this entire flight. He keeps checking that bag over and over. He's up to something, I'm sure of it. You need to search his bag before it's too late." Lisa took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," she began carefully, her tone firm but polite. "However, as I've mentioned before, all passengers and their belongings were thoroughly screened before boarding. Mr. Carter hasn't exhibited any behavior that warrants further action." Sarah's expression darkened. "Normal? You're calling that normal? People like him always act normal until they don't. I can't believe you're just ignoring this." Her voice rose slightly, and a few passengers nearby began to glance in their direction. Lisa's eyes flicked toward James, who remained seated, reading his book with an air of calm obliviousness. Turning back to Sarah, Lisa softened her tone, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you, we are monitoring the situation. If there were any real cause for concern, we would take immediate action. I need you to trust that we are prioritizing the safety and comfort of everyone on this flight." Sarah crossed her arms, her face flushed with frustration. "You're just brushing me off," she accused. "That's what people always do. Ignore the warning signs until it's too late." Lisa's professional mask stayed firmly in place, though inside she felt a flicker of wariness. She had dealt with anxious and suspicious passengers before, but Sarah's persistence was unusually intense. "Ma'am," Lisa said firmly, her voice lowering slightly to emphasize the seriousness of her words, "unless there is concrete evidence of a threat, we cannot and will not violate another passenger's privacy. Please, I need you to remain calm and trust the procedures in place." Sarah huffed loudly, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is exactly why bad things happen. People like you refuse to act when there's a clear danger staring you in the face." Lisa straightened, her expression resolute. "I understand your feelings, ma'am, but this conversation needs to end here. Please let us do our job, and if you notice anything truly concerning, let us know." Seeing she was getting no further, Sarah reluctantly leaned back in her seat, still glaring at James. Lisa walked away, her professional facade intact, but her mind alert. She knew the situation wasn't over. It was just a matter of when Sarah would escalate her behavior again. Sarah, meanwhile, fumed silently, convinced she was the only one taking the potential danger seriously. Her determination only hardened as she resolved not to let the issue rest. For her, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the tension in the cabin mounted, Sarah Walker's patience snapped. Convinced that she was the only one seeing the supposed danger, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up abruptly. Her determined steps down the aisle caught the attention of nearby passengers, their curious glances following her as she marched toward James Carter's seat. James, seated near the emergency exit, noticed her approach and looked up from his book. His calm expression contrasted sharply with Sarah's agitation. She stopped directly in front of him, pointing an accusatory finger. "You," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "You think you're fooling everyone, but I've been watching you since we boarded. You keep checking that bag of yours, like you're hiding something. What are you up to?" James blinked, startled but composed. He set his book down gently on his lap and looked up at her. "Ma'am," he said in a measured tone, "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight." Sarah scoffed, her voice growing louder. "Don't play innocent with me. People like you always have an excuse. I demand that you show everyone what's in that bag right now." The tension in the cabin thickened as passengers turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Lisa, the flight attendant, hurried over, stepping between Sarah and James. Her voice was firm but calm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice and return to your seat. You're causing a disruption." Sarah pointed at James again, her face flushed with anger. "He's hiding something dangerous, and you're doing nothing about it. I have the right to feel safe on this flight." James sighed softly and unzipped his bag with deliberate care. Pulling out a small, clear case, he held it up for Sarah and Lisa to see. "This is what I've been checking," he said evenly. "It's my medication. I have a heart condition and need to keep this with me at all times." The passengers murmured softly, and a wave of relief and embarrassment seemed to ripple through the cabin. Lisa gave James a polite nod. Thank you for showing us, sir," she said gently. "I appreciate your cooperation." Sarah's face twisted with disbelief as she stared at the medication. "That can't be it," she muttered. Stepping back slightly, "There has to be more." Lisa turned to her, her voice firm. "Ma'am, you've seen what's in his bag. There's nothing dangerous here. Please return to your seat immediately." Seeing the disapproving stares of the passengers around her, Sarah hesitated, then slowly turned and walked back to her seat. James watched her go, his calm demeanor unshaken, though the weight of the moment lingered heavily on him. As the cabin buzzed with tension following Sarah Walker's dramatic confrontation with James Carter, Lisa, the flight attendant, quickly took charge of the situation. Standing between Sarah and James, she raised her hand slightly, addressing both with a composed but firm tone. "Ma'am, you've now seen what's in Mr. Carter's bag. There's nothing dangerous here," Lisa said, emphasizing each word carefully. "We need to move past this and ensure the rest of this flight remains peaceful." James, seated calmly, nodded his agreement. "I hope this clears up any concerns," he added, his tone measured and polite, as he carefully placed his medication back into his bag and zipped it closed. His deliberate composure seemed to pacify some of the passengers, who began murmuring quietly, their curiosity giving way to uneasy relief. However, Sarah remained unconvinced. She crossed her arms tightly, her jaw set in stubborn defiance. "You don't understand," she said sharply, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't over. He's hiding something else, I know it." Lisa took a deep breath, her professionalism never wavering, though her patience was being tested. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "we've addressed your concerns. There's nothing further to discuss. Please return to your seat and allow everyone to enjoy the rest of the flight." Sarah's eyes darted to James, then to the other passengers, many of whom were now looking at her with thinly veiled irritation. She hesitated, but finally turned and walked back to her seat, muttering under her breath, "You'll all see. I know I'm right." Lisa watched her carefully until she was seated, then turned to James, offering a small apologetic smile. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Carter," she said quietly. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." James nodded, his expression understanding. "I appreciate your handling of the situation," he said simply, then picked up his book, attempting to focus despite the lingering tension. As Lisa moved to the galley, she exchanged a quick glance with Jim, her colleague. "Keep an eye on her," she whispered. "I think she'll stay in her seat for now, but I don't trust that this is the end of it." Jim nodded. "Understood. Let's hope she doesn't escalate things again." The cabin settled momentarily, passengers returning to their activities, though the tension was still palpable. Some whispered to each other, casting occasional glances at Sarah or James. Sarah, meanwhile, sat stiffly in her seat, glaring ahead. Her mind raced, convinced she had uncovered something no one else could see. She scanned the other passengers for support, but found only looks of disapproval or discomfort. Lisa, monitoring the situation from a distance, remained on high alert. Years of experience told her the situation was fragile. One misstep could reignite the confrontation. She made rounds in the cabin, offering refreshments and keeping her demeanor calm to ease the unease lingering in the air. For the moment, the situation appeared under control. But the tension in Sarah's posture and the fixed determination in her eyes suggested she wasn't ready to let go of her belief in James's guilt. The flight crew silently braced themselves, prepared for the possibility of further escalation. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah Walker's simmering frustration began to boil over once again. Sitting rigidly in her seat, she muttered to herself, her gaze fixed intently on James Carter. Unable to contain her suspicions, she unbuckled her seatbelt for the second time and stood up abruptly. Her sudden movement drew the attention of nearby passengers, many of whom exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered nervously among themselves. Marching down the aisle toward James, Sarah's voice rang out, her words sharp and accusing. "I know you're up to something," she declared, pointing at him. "You can't fool me. I see what you're doing." James looked up from his book, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the commotion. He sighed softly, setting his book aside again. "Ma'am," he said in a steady tone, "I've already explained everything. There's nothing more to say." Lisa, who had been monitoring the cabin from the galley, immediately rushed over. Her voice was firm and authoritative as she stepped between Sarah and James, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat right now," she said. "Your behavior is disrupting the flight and causing unnecessary alarm among the passengers." Sarah's face turned red with anger. "I won't sit down. He's hiding something and you're just letting it happen. I demand that you search his bag again." Lisa took a deep breath, her composure intact, and glanced toward the front of the plane. The escalating situation had reached a tipping point. She leaned slightly toward Jim, who was standing nearby, and whispered, "Get the captain on the intercom and notify security. We need backup before this gets out of control." Jim nodded and hurried toward the cockpit, leaving Lisa to handle the immediate chaos. Passengers around them began murmuring louder, some visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation. A few shook their heads in disapproval, while others simply looked away, trying to ignore the disturbance. "Ma'am," Lisa said firmly, turning back to Sarah, "if you don't return to your seat and remain calm, I will have no choice but to involve the authorities when we land. This is your final warning." The mention of security caused Sarah to hesitate, but her determination didn't waver. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "You'll regret ignoring this." Lisa, with years of experience handling unruly passengers, didn't flinch. She gestured toward Sarah's seat. "Please, sit down. This is for your safety and the safety of everyone on board." Reluctantly, Sarah returned to her seat, though she continued muttering under her breath. Meanwhile, Lisa moved to the front of the plane to brief the captain, preparing for a coordinated response upon landing. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the passengers and crew bracing for what might come next. As the confrontation aboard Flight 289 escalated, Lisa, the flight attendant, stepped in once more to address the growing tension. Sarah Walker sat stiffly in her seat, her face a mix of frustration and indignation. Meanwhile, James Carter, the man at the center of her accusations, remained composed. With the weight of many eyes on him, James decided it was time to put the matter to rest. He stood slightly from his seat, careful to keep his demeanor calm and measured, and addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I understand that there's been some concern about me during this flight. I'd like to take a moment to clarify the situation." Passengers who had been watching the scene unfold in uneasy silence now turned their full attention to James. He reached into his carry-on bag and retrieved a small, clear plastic case, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is my heart medication," he explained. "I have a condition that requires me to carry this with me at all times and check it regularly to ensure it's accessible and in good condition." The murmurs that had filled the cabin moments before began to subside. Many passengers looked relieved, exchanging glances as if to say, "That makes sense." James continued, maintaining his composure. "I also happen to be on my way to Los Angeles for work. For those who are still concerned, I have my credentials with me." From his bag, James produced an ID card and held it up briefly for Lisa and nearby passengers to inspect. Though he didn't elaborate on his occupation, the professional nature of the ID and his calm explanation seemed to reassure most of the onlookers. Lisa, standing beside him, nodded approvingly, her voice warm as she said, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We appreciate your patience and willingness to clarify the situation." Many passengers visibly relaxed, some even offering James polite nods or murmured apologies for the disturbance. The tension that had gripped the cabin began to dissipate, but not for everyone. Sarah Walker remained unconvinced, her lips pressed into a thin line, her face flushed with frustration as she shook her head. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice tight. "People like him always have a story, always have a way to explain things away." Lisa turned to Sarah, her professionalism intact but her patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, you've heard Mr. Carter's explanation and seen his credentials. There is no evidence of any wrongdoing. I need to ask you to let this matter rest for the remainder of the flight." Sarah crossed her arms, her voice trembling with defiance. "No, I won't let it go. He's hiding something, I just know it. You're all going to regret ignoring me." James, hearing her words, took a deep breath. He locked eyes with Sarah, his expression calm but resolute. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I understand that you may have concerns, but baseless accusations only serve to create unnecessary fear and tension. I'm simply trying to get to my destination like everyone else." His words struck a chord with some of the passengers, who began to murmur in agreement. A man sitting a few rows away said aloud, "He's explained himself. Just let it go already." Another woman nodded, adding, "This has gone far enough." Sarah glanced around, noticing the growing lack of support among her fellow passengers. The disapproving stares and murmurs of discontent only fueled her frustration. "You're all blind," she muttered, turning away from the group. "You'll see soon enough." Lisa, sensing that any further escalation could disrupt the flight, leaned down to speak to Sarah in a low, firm tone. "Ma'am, for the safety and comfort of everyone on board, I'm asking you one last time to remain calm and return to your seat quietly. If this behavior continues, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities when we land." Though her face was still flushed with defiance, Sarah didn't respond. She sat back stiffly, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the back of James's seat. Lisa, satisfied that the situation had de-escalated for the moment, nodded to James. "Thank you again, Mr. Carter. If you need anything, please let us know." James offered her a polite smile. "I appreciate your understanding," he said, then returned to his book, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The cabin gradually quieted as passengers turned back to their own activities. While the tension wasn't entirely gone, James's calm explanation and Lisa's firm handling of the situation had brought some measure of peace. For most, the incident seemed resolved. But for Sarah, it was far from over. Her thoughts churned as she stared out the window, convinced she had uncovered a threat no one else could see. The flight crew, aware of her lingering hostility, remained vigilant, preparing for the possibility of further trouble before the flight's end. As Flight 289 cruised steadily toward its destination, the uneasy calm that had temporarily settled over the cabin began to fray. Sarah Walker, seated stiffly in her row, continued to fume silently, her eyes darting toward James Carter, who sat calmly several rows ahead. Though James had already explained the contents of his bag and shown his credentials, Sarah remained unconvinced. Her suspicions boiled just beneath the surface and her restlessness was palpable. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, observed Sarah from her station, near the front of the cabin. She could see the tension etched across Sarah's face. Her tight-lipped scowl and rigid posture, a clear indication that she hadn't let the matter rest. Lisa exchanged a glance with Jim, her colleague stationed at the back. Through subtle gestures and a clear whispered exchange earlier, they had agreed to keep a close watch on Sarah to prevent any further escalation. For her part, Sarah felt increasingly isolated and frustrated. She was convinced she had uncovered something no one else had the courage or insight to see, and the lack of support from the crew and her fellow passengers only fueled her indignation. She leaned toward the woman sitting next to her, a middle-aged passenger who had been quietly theoretically working through a magazine. "You can't honestly think everything's fine," Sarah whispered, her tone urgent. "And the man is hiding something, I'm sure of it." The woman, visibly uncomfortable, glanced toward James and then back at Sarah. "I don't see anything wrong," she said cautiously. "He seems calm and he's explained himself. Maybe you should let it go." Sarah's expression darkened. "Let it go?" That's exactly how disasters happen. People ignore the signs until it's too late. You'll all regret this when something happens. The woman turned back to her magazine, clearly unwilling to engage further. Sarah huffed, crossing her arms tightly as she sank back into her seat. Around her, other passengers had begun to notice her agitation. Some exchanged glances, whispering quietly, while others tried to ignore the tension altogether, focusing on their in-flight entertainment or books. Lisa, sensing the growing unease in the cabin, decided to take action to maintain control. She walked down the aisle with her usual professional composure, pausing briefly near Sarah's seat. "Ma'am," she said in a calm but firm tone, "is there anything I can assist you with?" Sarah looked up sharply, her frustration spilling over. "Assist me? No, I don't need your assistance. I need you to do your job and protect this plane. That man is dangerous, and you're all ignoring it." Lisa took a deep breath, keeping her tone steady. "Ma'am, we've addressed your concerns, and there is no evidence of any danger. Mr. Carter has been cooperative and has done nothing to warrant further suspicion. I'm going to ask you again to remain calm and allow everyone to enjoy the rest of the flight." Sarah's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of more passengers. "You're just as blind as the rest of them. You don't even care if something happens, do you?" Lisa crouched slightly to meet Sarah's gaze directly, lowering her voice to avoid alarming the surrounding passengers further. "Ma'am, I need to remind you that your behavior is disrupting the flight. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have no choice but to involve the authorities when we land. Please, for your own sake and the comfort of others, Stay seated and remain calm. Sarah glared at Lisa but said nothing. Her breathing was heavy, her frustration evident. After a tense pause, she slumped back into her seat, muttering under her breath. Lisa straightened, offering a polite but firm nod before moving further down the aisle, her keen eyes scanning for any additional signs of unrest. The cabin remained thick with tension. Though the immediate confrontation had been de-escalated, many passengers were visibly on edge. A man a few rows back leaned over to whisper to his companion, "What's her problem? She's making everyone uncomfortable." Another passenger shook her head, whispering, "She just won't let it go, will she?" James, seated near the emergency exit, maintained his composure, though the weight of the situation was not lost on him. He had resumed reading his book, but his focus was fractured. He could feel the lingering glances of passengers and hear the faint murmurs that occasionally drifted his way. Despite this, he remained outwardly calm, determined not to give Sarah or anyone else any reason to doubt his innocence. In the galley, Lisa gathered briefly with Jim and another crew member to discuss the situation. "She's not letting this go," Lisa said quietly. "We need to be ready, in case she tries something again." Jim nodded. "She's definitely a wild card. Should we alert the captain to be prepared?" Lisa hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. "Yes, let him know what's going on and make sure security is ready when we land. I don't think she'll escalate further, but we can't take any chances." As Jim headed toward the cockpit to update the captain, Lisa resumed her rounds, projecting calm and control despite the undercurrent of unease in the cabin. She stopped occasionally to check on passengers, offering drinks or answering questions, her professionalism unwavering. Each time she passed by Sarah's seat, she cast a discreet but watchful glance, ensuring the situation remained under control. For the remainder of the flight, Sarah alternated between glaring at James and muttering to herself. Though she stayed in her seat, her simmering hostility was evident to anyone nearby. The tension in the cabin lingered, a quiet but heavy presence that prevented most passengers from fully relaxing. As the plane continued its journey, the crew remained vigilant, ready to step in at a moment's notice. They knew that the final resolution would come only once the plane landed, and Sarah's behavior could be addressed by the authorities. Until then, they worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile calm that had settled over Flight 289. As Flight 289 approached its destination, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Although the earlier confrontations had subsided, the underlying unease lingered. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending to focus on books or in-flight entertainment, while others cast occasional glances toward Sarah Walker. Her rigid posture and sharp glances toward James Carter made it clear she had not let go of her suspicions. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, kept a watchful eye on Sarah. She had been monitoring her behavior closely since the earlier escalation and knew any further disturbance could unsettle the passengers again. As she moved through the aisle, offering refreshments and attending to other travelers, she exchanged brief glances with Jim, her colleague stationed at the back of the plane. Their silent communication spoke volumes. Both were prepared to intervene if Sarah made another move. Lisa paused at Jim's station to quietly discuss the situation. "She's still agitated," Lisa murmured, glancing toward Sarah's seat, "but at least she stayed put for now." Jim nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, but the way she keeps glaring at that guy, I'm not convinced she's done. What's the plan if she acts up again?" Lisa sighed, adjusting her scarf out of habit. "We're close to landing. If she tries anything, we'll remind her firmly of the consequences and call the captain if necessary. Security is already on standby to meet us at the gate." Jim's expression hardened. "Good call. Better to be over-prepared." Lisa nodded and continued her rounds, her professional demeanor masking the concern she felt inside. As she walked past Sarah's seat, she noticed the woman was gripping the armrests tightly, her jaw clenched. It was clear she was still stewing over what she believed was a grave oversight by the crew and passengers alike. Her gaze was fixed on James, who remained calm, flipping through his book as though oblivious to the scrutiny. James, for his part, was fully aware of the tension. Though he appeared relaxed, he could feel Sarah's eyes on him and the faint buzz of whispered conversations around him. Deciding not to react, he kept his focus on the pages in front of him, unwilling to give her or anyone else a reason to suspect him of wrongdoing. Still, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He just wanted the flight to end peacefully. As Lisa moved closer to the front of the plane, she approached a passenger who had witnessed much of the earlier drama. "How are you doing?" she asked kindly, kneeling slightly to meet their gaze. The passenger shrugged. "I'm fine, but it's hard to relax with all the tension. Is everything under control?" Lisa nodded reassuringly. "We've been monitoring the situation and everything is under control. I assure you we're taking all necessary precautions." Her calm response seemed to ease the passenger, who smiled faintly and returned to their book. Lisa continued toward the galley, catching Jim's eye again on her way. He gave her a slight nod, signaling that Sarah hadn't moved or caused any further disruptions. As the captain announced the plane's descent, Lisa felt a flicker of relief. The end of the flight was in sight, and while the situation with Sarah had been managed so far, she remained on edge. She returned to the galley, where Jim joined her briefly. "She's still watching him like a hawk," Jim said quietly. "But she hasn't moved since you talked to her last." "Ah, that's good," Lisa replied. "Let's hope it stays that way. Just a little longer and we'll have security handle the rest." The flight began its descent, and passengers stirred in their seats, some packing away belongings, while others stretched and prepared for landing. Sarah, however, remained stiff and unmoving, her eyes still locked on James. Lisa, aware of every subtle movement, stayed vigilant, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of trouble. As the plane tilted slightly, beginning its final approach, Lisa made one last pass through the cabin. She stopped briefly near James, offering him a kind smile. "How are you holding up, Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. James nodded, his voice low but steady. "I'm fine, thank you. Just ready for this to be over." Lisa gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll be on the ground soon. Thank you for your patience." With that, she moved back toward Sarah's seat. Though Sarah didn't look up, Lisa lingered just long enough to ensure she wasn't planning anything. The situation remained stable, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Both Lisa and Jim knew they had done everything possible to maintain control, and now they only had to make it through the final minutes of the flight. As Flight 2889 rolled to a stop at the gate, the tension that had simmered throughout the journey reached its final crescendo. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warmly thanking the passengers for their cooperation during the flight, and announcing that the crew would assist with disembarkation. However, for one passenger, the end of the flight was anything but routine. The cabin door opened, and two uniformed security officers stepped aboard, their expressions serious but professional. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, met them at the front of the plane, briefly explaining the situation in hushed tones. The officers nodded in understanding before making their way down the aisle towards Sarah Walker, who sat stiffly in her seat near the middle of the plane. Passengers turned their heads as the officers approached, murmurs rippling through the cabin. Sarah, sensing their arrival, glanced up, her face a mixture of defiance and disbelief. "This is outrageous," she muttered, her voice loud enough to draw more attention. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am," one of the officers said firmly but politely, "we need you to come with us. Please gather your belongings and follow us off the aircraft." Sarah's face flushed with indignation as she looked around, searching for an ally among the other passengers. None met her gaze. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to relief. with a few showing quiet disapproval. Realizing she had no support, Sarah reluctantly rose from her seat, grumbling under her breath as she collected her bag. As the officers escorted her toward the front of the plane, she continued to protest, though her voice lacked the force it had carried earlier. "This is ridiculous. You're making a mistake. He's the one you should be questioning," she said, pointing toward James Carter as she passed. James, still seated near the emergency exit, remained calm. He didn't look up or respond, choosing instead to quietly close the book he had been reading. His composure in the face of the ordeal hadn't wavered, even as the weight of the situation lingered. Once Sarah had been escorted off the plane, Lisa approached James one last time. "Mr. Carter, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding. I'm truly sorry for what you experienced today." James gave her a polite nod, his voice steady. "Thank you. I understand these situations aren't easy to handle. I just hope everyone can move on from this." As passengers began disembarking, many cast fleeting glances at James, some offering subtle nods or smiles of acknowledgement. James remained seated, allowing the crowd to pass before he quietly collected his belongings, ready to leave the ordeal behind. At the bustling baggage claim area, James Carter stood quietly by the carousel, waiting for his luggage. The weight of the day's events lingered in his mind, but his calm demeanor remained intact. Around him, passengers from Flight 289 gathered in small groups, their subdued conversations a mix of relief and reflection. Some passengers spoke in hushed tones, their words tinged with disapproval for Sarah Walker's actions. "She caused so much unnecessary drama," one woman muttered to her companion. "It's a shame he had to go through that." Others, while acknowledging the disruption, tried to rationalize Sarah's behavior. "I think she was genuinely scared," a man said cautiously, "but she handled it all wrong." James noticed a few passengers casting glances his way, some offering polite nods or brief smiles. He returned their gestures with quiet acknowledgement, unwilling to let the incident define him or the journey. The carousel rumbled as bags began to appear, and James reached for his luggage with steady hands. As he turned to leave, he took a deep breath, ready to move forward. The whispers behind him faded into the background, and with calm resolve, James exited the terminal, leaving the ordeal behind. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the biases and prejudices that persist in everyday life. Sarah Walker's actions, fueled by unfounded suspicions, highlight the dangers of making assumptions about others based on preconceived notions. Meanwhile, James Carter's calm composure under scrutiny reflects remarkable strength and dignity in the face of discrimination. The professionalism and patience shown by Lisa and the flight crew played a crucial role in diffusing the situation, ensuring the safety and comfort of all passengers despite the tension. This narrative underscores the importance of empathy, understanding, and giving others the benefit of the doubt. It challenges us to confront our own biases and to treat every individual with respect, regardless of appearances or personal assumptions. In moments of conflict, professionalism and level-headedness can make all the difference in resolving issues peacefully. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to Real Life Stories for more thought-provoking narratives that reflect the challenges and triumphs of everyday life. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires, educates, or moves you. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.